Imagine walking into the doctor's office and finding jars of leeches wriggling on the shelf, a pile of rusty knives on the table, and, oh yes, a bucket of fresh cow dung waiting by the door. Welcome to medieval medicine, where the cure was often worse than the disease, but at least it made for great stories. Welcome back to Eyes Shut History. Before we dive into this gruesome tale, I would like you to subscribe and comment if you learned something from these stories, or they sent you straight off to sleep. It really helps me to keep writing these stories for you guys. Now sit back and relax and listen until your eyes shut to history. In the Middle Ages, sickness wasn't an occasional nuisance. It was a constant companion, the sort of roommate who never paid rent and coughed directly into your face. A cold could turn into a fever that lasted weeks. An infected splinter could end your life. Antibiotics and antiseptics were centuries away, and the hospitals that did exist were hardly places of recovery. Straw pallets lined with feverish bodies. The moans of the dying echoing through halls meant more for prayers than for cures. These were the healing institutions of the age. For most people, illness was a shadow that walked beside them, sometimes far off, sometimes close enough to touch. The medieval world was alive with disease, quite literally, though no one could have explained it in terms of bacteria or viruses. That knowledge lay far in the future. Instead, illness was understood through theories that today sound like a curious blend of astrology, alchemy, and guesswork. Still, before we get to those theories, picture the hazards of daily life. Water could not be trusted. A sip from a stream was an invitation to dysentery. The air itself was thought to carry corruption, and if it smelled foul, then the sickness was surely lurking within it. Food spoiled quickly. Bread grew dangerous molds, meat turned in the heat, milk soured before it could be drunk. And then there was childbirth, the most ordinary miracle of life and one of the most common causes of death for women. The odds were merciless, and midwives armed with nothing but experience, whispered prayers, and whatever herbs they could gather were all that stood between mother and grave. For many, life was short. Average lifespans hovered around 30 to 40 years, though this is deceptive, pulled down by the grim reaping of children who never saw their first birthdays. Those who survived infancy could live into their 50s or 60s, but even then, sickness hovered, waiting for a wound to fester or a cough to grow deeper. If you asked a medieval doctor why someone fell ill, he would not have mentioned infection or germs. Instead, he would talk of the four humours. It was an idea inherited from the ancient Greek physician Galen, whose writings were revered for 1,000 years. According to him, the human body was ruled by four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each carried its own qualities, hot or cold, wet or dry, and health was nothing more than the delicate balance of these elements. Too much blood, and you would burn with fever. Too much phlegm, and you became sluggish and weak. Excess yellow bile made you sharp-tempered and rash, while black bile brought melancholy that sank into the bones. If you woke grumpy on a Monday morning, don't blame lack of coffee. In their world, your black bile was having a tantrum. This system was persuasive because you could see blood, you could spit phlegm, you could imagine bile pooling in your stomach. It gave a logic, however flawed, to the mysteries of disease, and so treatments followed this model. A headache might mean excess blood, so a vein was opened to let it out. A fever might call for cooling draughts. Feeling weak. Perhaps too much phlegm, best dried out with powders and herbs that made the patient gag. It was science of a kind, but mixed with superstition and more than a little wishful thinking, yet no matter how many veins were opened or herbs prescribed, the final word on healing often belonged to God. Illness was seen as punishment for sin, or perhaps as a trial sent to strengthen the soul. Pilgrimage was medicine. Relics were remedies. If you had the means, you might carry a candle across the land to the shrine of a saint, hoping their bones could intercede on your behalf. Priests and monks served as healers, blending prayers with poultices, psalms with syrups. Monasteries sometimes offered better care than towns. Monks kept herb gardens, copied medical recipes, and brewed concoctions that actually contained useful ingredients. But faith was always the foundation. If you recovered, it was God's will. If you did not, heaven's gates would open, and that too was counted as a cure. The heavens above were not only for prayers. Doctors studied them with charts and diagrams, consulting the stars before bleeding a patient or prescribing a purge. Astrology and medicine were siblings. If Saturn was ill-placed, it was a bad time to treat the liver. If the moon was waxing, bloodletting might flow too freely. Physicians even carried drawings of the zodiac man, a figure whose body was mapped with constellations, each organ tethered to a planet's fortune. The cosmos moved the tides, they reasoned, so why should it not move the blood within our veins? And then there were the smells. To us they would be unbearable. To them, they were a daily reality. Streets lined with open drains, waste from humans and animals alike pooling in the sun, food rotting in market stalls, all of it merging into a stench that clung to the air. Doctors believed these foul odors carried disease, the dreaded miasma. To counter them, they prescribed stronger smells. A patient might be urged to sniff roses or lavender, to carry vinegar-soaked cloths, even to inhale smoke from burning sulfur. In plague years, the long-beaked masks of doctors were stuffed with herbs and spices, little gardens of scent meant to defend against the poison of the air. Sometimes it even worked, though not for the reasons they thought. Lavender and rosemary do have mild antibacterial powers, a tiny victory hidden inside a mountain of misunderstanding. It would be easy to laugh at them, these doctors with their bleeding bowls and astrology charts. But they were not fools. They were trying, with the tools and knowledge at hand, to make sense of a world where disease struck without warning and often without mercy. They could see the fluids of the body, they could smell corruption in the air, they could feel heat and cold in the skin. They built a system that explained what their eyes and hands could grasp, and if sometimes the cure hurt more than the sickness, well, it gave hope. And in a world where sickness was everywhere, sometimes hope was the only medicine you had. If you were sick in the Middle Ages, the question was not simply what was wrong with you, but who you trusted to prod, poke, or pour things into you. Healing was not the monopoly of a single profession, but a marketplace of options, each with its own promises and perils. Some wore gowns of velvet and spoke Latin, others wore leather aprons stained with blood and carried razors sharp enough to make your stomach turn. At the lofty end of the scale were the physicians, men trained, if one could call it that, in universities where they read the works of Galen and Hippocrates, pored over astrology charts, and learned to argue about humors with great seriousness. They were not expected to touch their patients too much, for such work was beneath them. Instead, they would study your urine in a glass flask, swirling it gently and holding it up to the light. The color, the cloudiness, even the bubbles told them stories, or so they claimed. If you complained of headaches, the physician might scribble notes in Latin and recommend a purge, a bleeding, or a bitter draught made with ingredients so rare that only the wealthy could afford them. His presence was more symbolic than practical. The physician was an emblem of learned medicine, a man who could murmur impressive words while the patient either got better on their own or died with a sense of dignity that someone important had at least looked at them. If you could not afford such grandeur, or if you had something that needed cutting, you turned to the barber-surgeon. These were the men who shaved beards in the morning and sawed through bones in the afternoon. Their red and white striped poles still remembered in the symbols of barbershops today. Their trade was a blend of skill and horror. They could set a broken bone, lance a boil, pull a tooth with alarming speed or cut away rotten flesh. They also performed bloodletting, applying leeches, or simply opening a vein with a practiced slice. A skilled barber-surgeon could save your life. A clumsy one could end it just as quickly. Their shops smelled of iron and soap, their aprons stiff with stains, and their hands steady from long practice. For many, they were the only doctors who actually did anything, though what they did might not always be survivable. Then there were the apothecaries, keepers of jars and powders, sellers of potions and salves. Their stalls were lined with shelves crammed full of dried herbs, roots, spices, and the occasional strange item like powdered mummy or ground-up pearls. Step inside and the air would overwhelm you with the mingled scents of rosemary, garlic, and things far less pleasant. Apothecaries were practical men and women who knew which plants soothed a cough, which numbed pain, and which might just kill you if taken in the wrong dose. Some worked closely with physicians, filling prescriptions written in fine Latin script, while others catered to ordinary folk who wanted a quick cure for their aches and fevers. Whether their remedies worked was hit or miss, but at least they offered something tangible to swallow, rub, or burn. And on the edges of villages or hidden within their own communities were the wise women and folk healers. They had no diplomas or fancy titles, but they carried recipes passed down for generations, cures whispered over the cradle and the sickbed alike. A wise woman might prepare a poultice of herbs for your wound, brew a tea to ease childbirth, or mutter charms to keep the fever spirits away. Sometimes they were loved, sometimes feared. In good times they were valued as caretakers, but in times of panic, when crops failed or plague swept the land, their knowledge could be twisted into accusations of witchcraft. Still, people came to them in droves, because their cures were grounded in the practical world: honey to soothe a throat, willow bark to ease pain, garlic to cleanse wounds. They may not have known why these things helped, but often they did. Between all of these healers stretched a kind of hierarchy, though it was loose and ever-shifting. The physician stood at the top, cloaked in status. The barber-surgeon stood in the middle, sleeves rolled up and blade in hand. The apothecary dealt in powders and potions, somewhere between science and sorcery. And the wise woman waited at the edge of town, offering remedies for those who trusted more in tradition than in Latin books. Choosing between them was never easy. A wealthy merchant might summon a physician only to see his child die despite the impressive words. A farmer might put his trust in the old woman with her bundle of herbs and find the fever broken by morning. A knight struck on the battlefield might bless the rough hands of a barber-surgeon who stitched him together with nothing but linen thread and grit. And in the end, the outcome was always a gamble, for no matter who wielded the knife, the flask, or the charm, sickness had the last word more often than not. What united all of these healers was the sense that medicine was as much performance as cure. To see a physician swirl your urine was to feel that something was being done. To watch a barber-surgeon bleed your arm was to feel the sickness draining out, even if weakness flooded in behind it. To drink a potion from an apothecary's shop was to swallow hope along with herbs. To hear a wise woman chant her spells was to believe that unseen forces might finally turn in your favor. Medieval medicine was never just about the body. It was about faith, theater, and the human need to believe that healing was possible, even in a world where it so often was not. The cure, in medieval eyes, was rarely gentle. To be healed often meant to be cut, burned, bled, or forced to swallow something that made your stomach rebel. Yet people submitted themselves willingly, even eagerly, because the alternative, to do nothing and let sickness run its course, was far worse. Medicine in those days was not about comfort, it was about action, and the very act of being treated was half the battle. If it hurt, it must be working. The most common and most trusted cure was bloodletting. Imagine a physician peering at you, shaking his head, and declaring your humors out of balance. The answer: open a vein and let the excess drain away. A barber-surgeon would roll up your sleeve, tie a strip of cloth tight around your arm, and produce a knife honed to cruel sharpness. With a steady slice, your blood would spill into a bowl. The sound of it, the sight of it, the weakness that followed, all of it convinced you that something vital was leaving your body, some hidden poison drawn out with the crimson flow. If you were lucky, you survived the cure along with the illness. If not, the bleeding simply sped you on your way to the churchyard. For those who flinched at the knife, there were leeches placed carefully on your skin. They latched with a soft but unsettling bite, their bodies swelling as they drew out your blood. Some physicians swore by them, especially for delicate patients or children. The sight of the leech's fattened body, wriggling as it dropped away, was proof that the treatment had worked. And when the wound continued to ooze afterwards, it seemed doubly effective. Patients found it grotesque but oddly reassuring. The leech had taken their sickness and they were lighter for it. Herbal remedies filled the gap between knife and leech. Apothecaries kept shelves crammed with plants, dried and powdered, ready to be boiled into teas, crushed into poultices, or mixed with honey into lozenges. Some worked surprisingly well. Willow bark eased pain, mint settled the stomach, garlic fought infection. Others were less useful or actively harmful. You might be given hemlock for a cough, which could still that cough forever. Mandrake root was prized as an anesthetic, but too much could send you into hallucinations or death. And then there were the truly bizarre ingredients. Ground pearls for luxury treatments, dried earthworms for fevers, even powdered mummy imported from Egypt, sold as a universal cure. Imagine swallowing a pinch of centuries-old corpse dust and convincing yourself it would mend your broken ribs. Poultices and plasters were another favorite. A wound might be covered with a paste of herbs and honey, which at least kept it moist and sealed. But there were less pleasant recipes too. Pigeon droppings smeared on a chest were thought to draw out illness. Cow dung applied to wounds was said to keep away infection, though more often it invited it in. Bread mold, curiously enough, sometimes did help, as certain strains contained the beginnings of what we would later call penicillin. But of course, nobody understood that. It was just luck that one foul-smelling mixture might actually work better than another. Purging was another common approach. If sickness lurked within, then surely it must be driven out. Patients were dosed with strong laxatives or emetics until their bodies heaved and emptied. To vomit or to spend hours on the privy was seen as proof that corruption had been expelled. The worse the ordeal, the more convinced you were that you had been cleansed. After all, if medicine didn't make you miserable, could it really be medicine? Fire, too, played its role. Cauterization was used to stop bleeding, to seal wounds, or to burn away infection. A red-hot iron pressed to the skin brought agony and the stench of cooked flesh, but it also left behind a sense of grim finality. Whatever sickness had been in the wound was surely destroyed in the flame. Sometimes it even worked. Bacteria stood no chance against white-hot metal, though the patient's strength might not last long enough to appreciate the cure. Astrology guided many of these treatments. The stars could determine when you were bled, what herbs were gathered, which remedies would suit your body. A patient might be told to wait until the moon was waning before opening a vein, or to take a potion only when Jupiter was rising. The sky was a silent partner in every cure, its patterns written into the flesh of those who believed. And then there were charms and prayers, cures of the spirit as much as the body, words whispered over water, crosses drawn on skin, relics pressed to fevered brows. Pilgrims returned from shrines with bottles of holy oil or flasks of blessed water, eager to swallow or rub them into their sores. The act of belief itself could lift a heart, and sometimes a lifted heart was enough to carry the body through sickness. To modernize, these cures appear cruel, ridiculous, even laughable. Yet to those who lived under their shadow, they were lifelines. To be bled was to feel your sickness leave with your strength. To swallow bitter herbs was to taste your determination to live. To carry a relic was to believe that heaven itself walked beside you. The cures of the Middle Ages were rarely gentle, often dangerous, and frequently useless. But they were something. They were hope given shape, whether in a knife's edge, a leech's bite, or a charm murmured in the dark. And in a world where sickness had more power than kings, hope was the one cure no one could afford to live without. When the plague came, it did not announce itself with a whisper. It arrived with coughs that turned into blood, swellings that blackened beneath the skin, and a silence in the streets where life had been. In towns across Europe, the air grew heavy with the tolling of bells, each peal another life carried away. The Black Death, as it would be remembered, was less a disease than a storm, and when it broke, there was nowhere to hide. Imagine the fear of waking with a swelling beneath your arm or at the base of your neck, a lump that burned and throbbed until it grew to the size of an egg. These buboes marked you as doomed. Neighbors whispered, families fled, priests crossed themselves and hurried on. You could see death growing on your body, and so could everyone else. The smell of sickness clung to you, a reek of rot even before the grave had claimed you. Cures in such a time were desperate. Physicians with their learned charts were as helpless as the poorest villager. Some advised lancing the buboes and applying poultices of herbs, or more revoltingly, mixtures of dried toads or excrement, hoping the poison would be drawn out. Others prescribed drinking concoctions of wine mixed with crushed emeralds or gold dust, as if swallowing wealth could bribe death into passing by. The wealthy bled themselves, vomited themselves empty, and swallowed powders ground from precious stones, but plague cared nothing for their riches. The streets filled with the sound of penitents, bands of flagellants marching from town to town. Barebacked, they whipped themselves until blood ran down their skin, chanting prayers with every strike. To them the plague was punishment for sin, and only by scourging their own flesh could they turn aside God's wrath. Crowds gathered to watch, weeping, praying, joining in. The crack of whips echoed in the night, a grim chorus to accompany the tolling bells. Yet the plague went on, indifferent to their devotion, and many who whipped themselves into exhaustion simply collapsed and joined the dead they had sought to avert. In houses and alleyways, incense was burned in thick clouds to purify the air. Spices were thrown onto coals, herbs stuffed into beaked masks worn by doctors who looked more like carrion birds than healers. The sight of a plague doctor stepping through the smoke, robes long and dark, face hidden behind a mask with glass eyes and a curved beak, must have been terrifying and oddly comforting all at once. He looked inhuman, but at least he looked prepared. Inside the beak were roses, lavender, rosemary, and vinegar-soaked cloths meant to ward off the foul air. The doctor himself believed he was defended by this fragrant fortress, but the disease slipped past herbs and cloth with ease. Quack cures multiplied as fear spread. Sellers hawked potions that promised to ward off plague, potions made of unicorn horn, which was really powdered narwhal tusk, concoctions of crushed sapphires, syrups of treacle boiled with every herb in the garden. People clutched charms, wore jewels, or carried posies of flowers to their noses. Children sang the rhymes of their time, little circles of roses meant to ward off the stench, rhymes that would echo centuries later in the memory of a nursery game. The panic of towns was indescribable. In some places, whole families locked their doors and starved rather than risk infection. In others, the dead were piled into carts and carried through the streets, bodies tumbling together in heaps, the sound of the wheels creaking under their weight. Priests struggled to keep up with the burials. Graveyards filled, pits were dug, and still the bodies came. The air grew foul, thick with the scent of decay, and those still alive believed it was the very breath of the plague itself. Some turned inward, retreating to country villas or monasteries, hiding behind walls and hoping the sickness would not breach them. Others turned outward, seeking pleasure in the face of death. Feasts, drunken revels, and desperate indulgence filled the nights in certain towns. If the plague was coming anyway, why not greet it with wine on your lips and laughter on your tongue? Chroniclers wrote with disgust of those who abandoned restraint, yet who could blame them? The grave was near at hand, and tomorrow was not promised. Even in the worst of it, healers continued their work. Monks brewed remedies from herbs, apothecaries sold their concoctions, physicians wrote their prescriptions. Some worked tirelessly, falling ill themselves, martyrs of medicine before the word existed. Others profited shamelessly, selling snake oil with a smile, their purses growing fat even as their neighbors withered. In every city, plague revealed both the best and worst of human nature. And then, as suddenly as it came, the storm passed. The bells grew quieter. The streets, though emptied of so many, began to stir again. Survivors stumbled out, blinking in the sunlight, carrying with them scars and memories. Children who had buried parents became heads of households overnight. Villages were half abandoned, fields overgrown, towns forever changed. Yet life resumed, because life always does. Crops were sown, markets reopened, lovers met in the ruins of what had been. But no one forgot. The memory of plague haunted the medieval mind like a ghost at every feast, whispering that death could return without warning, and return it did, in smaller waves, again and again. Each time the cures grew wilder, the fear sharper, the desperation deeper. Medieval medicine had no answer to plague, but it had rituals, remedies, and prayers, and sometimes that was all people needed to believe they had not been utterly abandoned in their darkest hour. Not every medieval illness came with the black swellings of plague or the rattle of death in the chest. Far more often it was the small miseries of daily life that sent people seeking cures. A toothache that throbbed until it blurred your thoughts. A headache that pounded with every sound. A childbirth that stretched hours into days, with cries echoing down timbered halls. These were the ailments that stalked men and women most often, and the cures were as creative as they were questionable. Take the humble toothache. Dentistry, as we would know it, did not exist. When a tooth began to rot, the pain could be unbearable. To ease it, people tried herbs. Clove oil rubbed on the gums, garlic chewed until the taste made you gag, sage leaves tucked inside the cheek. Some swore by charms, muttering prayers to Saint Apollonia, patron saint of toothaches, or wearing amulets inscribed with protective words. But when the pain grew too sharp, there was only one sure solution, the barber-surgeon's tongs. Picture sitting in his chair, the smell of soap and blood in the air as he gripped the tooth with iron pincers and yanked it free. There was no anesthetic, no numbing balm, only the hope that the agony of a moment would outweigh the agony of months. The crack of tooth from jaw must have been a sound remembered in nightmares, yet it was considered a cure, and often it worked, at least until the next tooth began to rot. Headaches were treated with equal inventiveness. Some physicians prescribed bleeding, claiming the head was too full of blood. Others recommended pressing herbs to the temples, rosemary or lavender, to soothe the pain. If that failed, there were stranger cures. A dead mole split in half and laid across the head was said to draw out the ache. So was wearing a wreath of ivy. And if desperation reached its peak, trepanation was the final resort. boring a hole into the skull to release the evil vapors trapped inside. Imagine lying still as a surgeon's hand twisted a metal drill against your head, the pressure mounting until bone cracked and the tool sank through. The shock of it, the terror, and the risk of death were immense, yet some survived, and some even claimed their headaches vanished afterwards. Childbirth was perhaps the most perilous ailment of all, though it was no ailment but a fact of life. Women bore their children in chambers filled with midwives, female relatives, and sometimes a priest standing ready with prayers should things go wrong. Herbs were given to ease pain, though ease is a generous word, and charms were whispered over swollen bellies. Saints were invoked, candles lit, relics pressed against the laboring woman's skin. If the birth dragged on too long, stronger measures were tried. Potions of wine mixed with bitter herbs, or oils rubbed on the belly. In the worst cases, a knife was brought, and the midwife or surgeon faced decisions that could save only mother or child, rarely both. Yet amid all this danger, life continued, and new voices cried out into the night, reminders that hope was always stronger than fear. And then there were the strange ailments of the heart, not of blood and bone, but of longing. Lovesickness was a genuine diagnosis in the Middle Ages, taken as seriously as fever or cough. A patient pale, listless, sighing at windows and refusing food might be declared lovesick, their humors unbalanced by desire. The cure, sometimes music, sometimes poetry, sometimes, more practically, marriage. But for those without means, charms and potions were brewed. A lock of hair slipped into a cup of wine, a powder of herbs mixed into bread, or more dangerously, concoctions that included dangerous plants like belladonna, which could just as easily kill as kindle desire. The line between medicine and magic blurred here as it so often did. For wounds, there were countless remedies. Honey was smeared into cuts, its natural antiseptic qualities unknowingly saving many from infection. Vinegar was poured into gashes, the sting considered proof of its virtue. But dung was also common, smeared into wounds to draw out the rot, though in truth it often delivered more rot than it removed. Some healers swore by animal fat, melted and rubbed into injuries, while others brewed ointments from every herb within reach. Success was inconsistent, but occasionally the right mixture of honey, wine, and herbs kept a soldier on his feet, when by all rights he should have been in the ground. Even fevers and colds had their arsenal of cures. Patients were wrapped in blankets to sweat out the sickness, or plunged into cold water to shock it away. They were given spiced wine, broth thick with garlic, or herbal teas that smelled more medicinal than edible. If the fever lingered, charms were tied to their necks or hung over their beds, inscribed with words half Latin, half incantation. And if death came regardless, the priest was summoned, the final prayers murmured, and the sickness declared part of God's mysterious plan. What is striking about these everyday cures is how close they sometimes came to true medicine. Garlic for infection, willow for pain, honey for wounds. Each was a step toward modern healing, though cloaked in layers of superstition and guesswork. Alongside them sat treatments bizarre and cruel, born of desperation and ignorance. A mole cut in half, dung smeared on wounds, holes drilled in skulls. The medieval world was a place where hope could be found in herbs or horrors, in saints or surgeons, in prayers, or in the steady hand of a barber with his iron tongs. And through it all, people endured. They endured the pain of yanked teeth, the torment of splitting heads, the terror of childbirth, and the indignities of treatments that burned, bled, or gagged them. They endured because there was no alternative, and because to endure was to live. And in that endurance we glimpse not just the strangeness of medieval medicine, but its humanity. The unyielding drive to try, however clumsily, to wrestle health from the grip of sickness and to find a cure, any cure, in a world where sickness was never far away. If you fell sick in the Middle Ages, your home was the first refuge, but when the illness grew too heavy to bear, you might be carried, or stumble yourself, to a place where the sick were gathered. Hospitals, though the name misleads us today, were not the bustling centers of surgery and science we imagine. They were shelters halfway between a monastery and an almshouse, where care meant food, prayers, and a clean bed, but rarely a cure. Step through the doors of such a place, and you would be struck first not by silence, but by the murmur of voices, the groans of patients, the chant of monks, and the rustle of nuns moving between beds. The air was thick with incense, meant to purify the space, and with the less holy scents of sweat, pus, and unwashed bodies. Rows of wooden beds lined the halls, often shared by more than one patient. To lie in a hospital was to lie in the company of strangers, united in suffering and in the faint hope that God's mercy might reach you. Monasteries were at the heart of this world of healing. Monks tended gardens rich with herbs, cultivating plants like sage, rosemary, fennel, and rue. In their scriptoria they copied ancient texts, preserving scraps of medical knowledge from Greece and Rome, often mingling it with their own experience of what worked in practice. The infirmary of a monastery was a place of order, where patients were washed, bandaged, and prayed over. A monk might brew a potion of honey and garlic for a cough, or steep willow bark in water for pain. His knowledge was part learning, part tradition, and part faith, and he administered it with the same hands that turned the pages of holy books. Hospitals in towns served a different role. Many were founded not just for the sick, but for the poor, the orphaned, the pilgrim, and the weary traveler. To enter one was to step into a place where charity and medicine blurred. A wealthy patron might endow a hospital as an act of piety, believing that tending to the sick earned favor in heaven. Within, care was often simple: broth, bread, water, and the watchful eye of a nurse. If healing came, it came as much from rest and nourishment as from any remedy administered. There were also leper houses, grim and necessary, where those stricken with leprosy were sent. To suffer leprosy in the Middle Ages was to be marked, not just with sores on the skin, but with the weight of fear and rejection. Lepers were seen as living reminders of sin, their illness a curse as much spiritual as physical. They were given special clothing, bells to announce their approach, and were often banished to the outskirts of towns. In leper houses they found a kind of community, cared for by priests and fellow sufferers, though the care was more spiritual than medical. To live there was to live half in the world and half out of it, an exile in life before the grave. On battlefields, healing spaces were makeshift at best. A wounded knight might be carried to a tent where a surgeon waited with bandages, knives, and boiling water. There, amid the mud and blood, limbs were set, wounds stitched, and arrows yanked from flesh. There was little time for delicacy. A man either endured the pain and lived, or he did not. Sometimes the battlefield surgeon was the most skilled of all, his hands practiced by necessity, his courage as steady as the soldiers he tended. His tools were crude, his success uneven, but in the chaos of war, even the chance of survival was worth the agony. For pilgrims, there were healing shrines, places where the boundary between medicine and miracle dissolved. To drink from a sacred spring, to touch the bones of a saint, to sleep in a chapel and wake healed. These were cures as real to the medieval mind as any herb or salve. The shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury, for instance, drew countless sick pilgrims who left behind crutches, bandages, and votive offerings in gratitude for cures they believed they had received. Whether the healing came from divine power, the placebo of belief, or simply the rest of a long journey, it mattered little. What mattered was that people left whole where once they had been broken. Hospitals, monasteries, leper houses, battlefield tents, and shrines, each was a stage where healing played out in its many medieval forms. Some offered herbs, Some offered prayers, some offered nothing more than a clean bed and a cup of broth. But all offered hope, and in an age when medicine was as uncertain as the weather, hope was the strongest remedy of all. To step into these places was to surrender to care, however imperfect, and to place your trust in the hands of monks, nurses, surgeons, or saints. And when you lay in those long halls, eyes tracing the beams above, listening to the groans of those around you, you might have felt that healing was less about the cure and more about the company. To be ill together, to pray together, to wait together, and perhaps, if fortune allowed, to rise together and walk out into the world once more. Not all cures were brewed in the quiet of an apothecary's shop or whispered in the hush of a monastery. Some came from darker corners, the realm of superstition, where the stars spoke of sickness, relics glowed with healing power, and charms were tied close to the skin like secret guardians. In the Middle Ages, the line between medicine and magic was not just blurred, it was invisible, and most people walked it daily without a second thought. Astrology was the guiding star of many a physician's work. Charts of the heavens were consulted before treatments were given because the body, like the earth itself, was thought to be governed by celestial rhythms. To bleed a patient when the moon was waxing might be dangerous, but when it was waning, it could be life-saving. Saturn's influence might worsen a melancholic humor, while Jupiter's rise was seen as auspicious for treating the liver. Imagine lying in your sickbed, weak with fever, while your physician peered not at your wound, but at the sky, muttering over the positions of Mars and Venus before deciding whether to bleed your arm or give you mint tea. To the medieval mind, this was not folly, it was precision. Charms were everywhere. Small scrolls inscribed with Latin words or symbols were tied around wrists or hung from necks. Some were stitched into little pouches and worn under clothes, never to be seen by anyone but the patient. A charm against fever might include the names of the three magi, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, written on parchment and dipped in wine before being swallowed. Others relied on repetition of holy phrases, whispered 3 or 9 times as if words themselves could chase illness away, and for many they did, for to believe a charm was to give it power. Relics played a role as well. Bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, drops of holy oil, or even the dust swept from the steps of a shrine were believed to carry miraculous healing. Pilgrims traveled long roads to touch these objects, to press them to sores, to drink water in which a relic had been dipped. Some returned cured, others not, but all returned with the certainty that they had brushed against the divine. Hospitals often kept relics too, placing them beside the beds of the sick. To be watched over by a saint was thought to be a medicine stronger than any herb. There were the stranger practices, the ones that read more like folklore than medicine. For jaundice, a patient might be told to eat a diet heavy in saffron or to gaze upon a yellow object for hours each day, as though color itself might cure. For warts, the remedy could be as simple as rubbing them with bacon fat and burying it in the ground, waiting for the wart to wither as the meat decayed. For epilepsy, known as the falling sickness, treatments ranged from swallowing powdered human skull to wearing amulets made from wolf's teeth. Each cure held a strange logic, stitched together from fear, tradition, and hope. Animals often played their part. A black cat's blood, a rooster's heart, or the ashes of a dog burned alive were listed in certain medical texts. Remedies that make us recoil today, but were penned with utter seriousness then. Sometimes the animal was not killed, but worn, a live frog tied to the throat for swelling, or a pigeon cut in half and strapped to the feet to draw fever downward. The suffering of the beast was thought to draw away the sickness of the man. To medieval minds, nature was a reservoir of power, and animals, like herbs, were vessels of it. Witchcraft and sorcery were never far from suspicion. A woman with too much knowledge of herbs might be called a healer one day and a witch the next. Villagers whispered of charms muttered over wells, of powders sprinkled in doorways, of eyes that lingered too long and brought sudden illness. Some accused witches of causing sickness, others sought them out for cures when no priest or physician could help. The church condemned such practices, but desperation drove people to them all the same. To drink a potion mixed in secret, to bury an object under a threshold, to whisper a name to the night. These were acts of medicine as much as magic, and they carried their own kind of hope. Superstition even crept into the daily rituals of health. People avoided certain foods on unlucky days, carried stones believed to ward off infection, or painted crosses on doors to keep out evil air. They swept floors in a particular direction, hung herbs from rafters, or wore rings engraved with astrological signs. Health was not simply about the body, but about harmony with the unseen world. To live well was to live in balance with forces beyond your understanding, and illness was often seen as a sign that balance had been broken. And so medieval medicine stretched far beyond herbs and knives. It reached into the sky, into the bones of saints, into the feathers of birds and the whispered charms of the village wise woman. To us it seems a tapestry of nonsense, threads of magic knotted with scraps of science. But to them it was seamless. To heal the body you healed the spirit, to heal the spirit you healed the body. No cure was too strange, no superstition too foolish, if it gave a flicker of hope to someone lying in the shadow of death. In the flicker of candlelight, in the rustle of charms against skin, in the whispered prayers to saints and stars, we glimpse a world where medicine was not just a science but a mystery, and the strangest cures of all were often the most deeply believed. If monks and physicians dealt in books and prayers, then surgeons dealt in blood. Their world was not the quiet scriptorium or the incense-thick ward, but the battlefield, the marketplace, the barber's chair. To be a surgeon in the Middle Ages was to be half craftsman, half butcher, and entirely indispensable in a world where wounds and injuries were as common as rain. The barber-surgeon is perhaps the most curious figure of all. Picture a little shop on a busy medieval street. The striped pole outside, its red recalling the blood of veins, its white the bandages wrapped around them. Inside, the barber's chair served two masters. One customer might sit down for a shave, the razor scraping across his cheek. The next would slump in, pale and sweating, and have his arm tied tight with a strip of cloth before the barber nicked a vein and let the blood run into a bowl. The belief was simple: too much blood in the body made one ill, and letting it flow out restored balance. But bloodletting was only the beginning. Barbers pulled teeth with iron tongs, lanced boils until pus spurted across their aprons, and stitched cuts with coarse thread. Their tools were simple, but their hands were practiced. They were men of speed and nerve, because hesitation meant pain, and pain meant panic. If you cried out, so be it. The barber's knife did not slow. The same razor that shaved a beard might an hour later scrape flesh from a festering wound. It was a grim business, but a necessary one. Surgeons of higher standing, those who served lords or accompanied armies, took their craft further. On battlefields, they hacked away armor to reach the flesh beneath, poured boiling oil into arrow wounds to cleanse them, and amputated limbs with saws that squealed against bone. Anesthetics were scarce. A swig of strong wine, a cloth bitten between the teeth, perhaps a prayer muttered under the breath. These were the only comforts. The patient's screams carried across the camp, and yet, if he survived, he blessed the surgeon's brutal work. To lose a leg was to lose much, but to lose life was worse. Bone setters were another breed, less feared than surgeons, but no less vital. They were often women, sometimes men, who had learned through long practice how to feel a bone broken beneath the skin, how to tug and twist until it slid back into place. No textbooks guided them, only experience and instinct. Their patients were peasants who had fallen in the fields, soldiers thrown from horses, children who had tumbled from trees. With hands firm and sure, the bone setter pulled and pressed, ignoring cries until the limbs straightened. Then came the splints, sticks bound with cloth, plaster of flour and egg, or even hardened clay, all meant to hold the bone steady while nature did its work. Amputations were among the darkest of surgical tasks. A limb blackened by infection or shattered beyond saving was a death sentence unless removed. Surgeons worked quickly, binding above the wound with a tourniquet, then sawing through flesh and bone in swift strokes. The stump was seared with hot iron to stop the bleeding, the smell of burned flesh mingling with the cries of the patient. Those who lived carried scars like brands, proof of survival. Those who died were many, but their deaths taught surgeons little. For each failure there was always another patient, another chance. Trepanation, too, remained a grim practice. The idea that a hole in the skull could release bad humors or evil spirits lingered for centuries. Surgeons drilled carefully, or as carefully as one could with the tools at hand, pressing metal against bone until it cracked. The risk of death was immense, yet the fact that some skulls show signs of healing proves that a few patients did indeed survive. Perhaps their headaches eased, perhaps their seizures lessened, or perhaps they were simply lucky. The instruments of these men and women tell their own story. Knives of every shape, saws curved and straight, hooks for pulling, forceps for gripping, needles for stitching. Many were crude by modern standards, but in skilled hands they were weapons against death. They gleamed in candlelight, were wiped clean on aprons, and then pressed into flesh again. Despite the blood and the pain, surgeons and bone setters earned respect. Their work was visible, immediate. A broken arm straightened, a festering wound drained, a dying man given another chance. They could not cure fevers or plague, but they could cut, pull, and mend, and in that rough craft lay their power. People feared them, but they also needed them, and in that need, these practitioners carved out their place in the vast, chaotic theater of medieval medicine. In the homes of peasants and lords alike, healing often began not with a physician in his robes or a surgeon with his knives, but with a woman at the hearth. She was a mother, a wife, a neighbor, a midwife, a figure who knew the herbs in the hedgerows, the prayers whispered at the bedside, and the secrets of keeping a family alive through sickness and hunger. Her knowledge was not written in books, but carried in memory, passed down like an heirloom from one generation to the next. For the poor, this kind of care was everything. A cut from a plough, a fever from a chill night, a child's cough that lingered too long. These were brought to the wise women of the village. They knew how to brew teas from chamomile, mint, or nettle. They knew poultices of honey and onion could draw the rot from a wound, and garlic mashed with vinegar could fight infection. They knew where foxglove grew in the woods, and how little of it to use before it tipped from medicine into poison. Their healing was practical, rooted in what the earth provided, and though it was wrapped in ritual and charm, it often worked better than the grand remedies of physicians. Midwives held a role more vital still. In a world where childbirth was as dangerous as battle, they were guardians at the threshold between life and death. They guided mothers through long hours of labor, offering herbs to dull pain, whispered prayers for strength, and steady hands to catch the child as it came screaming into the world. They cut cords, swaddled infants, and coaxed new life into lungs with gentle slaps or breaths of their own. For mothers who bled too much, they used cloths, pressure, and herbs to try to stem the tide. They could not always save both mother and child, but their presence gave hope in the most perilous of hours. These women also bore the weight of suspicion. Their skills, when they succeeded, were praised as blessings. When they failed, they were feared as curses. A woman who healed too well, whose herbs seemed too effective, might be whispered about as a witch. A midwife who lost too many children might be accused of bargaining with dark powers. The church frowned on practices it could not control, and the line between healer and sorceress was thin. Many women walked it with care, hiding their knowledge behind prayers and holy symbols, offering cures with one hand and a cross with the other. Still, the people trusted them. A mother with a fever trusted the wise woman more than a distant physician. A farmer with a festering wound trusted the poultice his neighbor prepared, and in childbirth no priest or surgeon could replace the midwife's touch. Their remedies might have been woven with superstition, but they were also grounded in experience, in the trial and error of countless lives tended and sometimes saved. We see glimpses of their craft in old recipe books, often disguised as household knowledge. Instructions for healing a cough might read, "Boil sage in wine, sweeten with honey, and give to the sick one thrice daily." A remedy for worms might involve crushed seeds of wormwood and prayers spoken over the child's belly. Some recipes mixed sacred with profane, calling for herbs to be gathered at dawn on Midsummer's Day or for charms to be recited while stirring. These were not seen as contradictions but as complements. God's power worked through the earth, and the earth's gifts were sanctified by prayer. In noble households, women too played their part. Queens and ladies often kept their own still rooms where herbs were distilled into tinctures, ointments, and waters. These were spaces of both science and devotion, lined with jars, bowls, and the scent of dried plants. Here, women brewed remedies not only for their families, but for servants, guests, and sometimes the wider community. It was a role that gave them quiet authority, a form of power less visible than crown or sword, but just as vital. The story of medieval medicine cannot be told without these women. They were the unseen physicians of the poor, the guardians of mothers, the stewards of herbs and remedies that linger even today in our kitchens and gardens. They worked with little recognition, often with suspicion, but their hands carried more lives safely through sickness than many a robed physician with his learned texts. And though some were lost to the flames of accusation, branded as witches when their knowledge seemed too strange or too threatening, their legacy endures in the herbs we still brew as tea, in the poultices we still lay on wounds, in the home remedies that echo across centuries. In them we hear the voices of countless unnamed women, keeping life alive in the shadow of sickness, one whispered charm, and one handful of herbs at a time. The Middle Ages were not as insular as we sometimes imagine. Though villages might seem sealed in their own rhythms, Europe itself was part of a web spun wide across the continents. From the markets of Cairo to the ports of Venice, from the Spice Islands to the Silk Road, remedies traveled as eagerly as merchants and pilgrims. Medicine, like silk or gold, was a commodity, and some of the most treasured cures of the medieval world arrived in small pouches carried by traders who had crossed half the earth. Spices were the most obvious of these treasures. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves were not just flavors for food, but ingredients in countless remedies. A pinch of pepper was thought to stir sluggish digestion, ginger to warm a cold stomach, cinnamon to strengthen the heart, and cloves to banish bad breath or soothe toothache. Apothecaries stocked their shelves with these costly imports, weighed carefully on brass scales, and sold them at prices so dear that only the wealthy could afford them. To sip a cordial spiced with cinnamon was not just to taste sweetness, but to taste status. Beyond spices came stranger substances still. From Arabia came musk, scraped from the glands of deer, used in perfumes and believed to revive fainting hearts. From the east arrived camphor, sharp and cooling, a substance ground into powders to ease fevers. Ambergris, a waxy lump coughed up by whales and found floating in the sea, was prized as a medicine for headaches and as an aphrodisiac. These exotic goods carried with them not only the promise of healing, but the glamour of distance, the sense that power lived in the rare and the far away. The Islamic world played a central role in this traffic of knowledge and remedies. While much of Europe still looked back to Galen and Hippocrates, physicians in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba were writing their own great texts, blending Greek wisdom with observations of their own. Men like Avicenna, whose canon of medicine became a cornerstone of medieval learning, catalogued herbs, minerals, and treatments with a clarity that put many European works to shame. Translated into Latin, these books filtered into Europe through Spain and Sicily, reshaping the medical imagination of the West. From Africa and the Middle East also came resins and gums, frankincense to burn in sick rooms, myrrh to mix into balms, aloes to ease wounds. These substances, already ancient in their use, carried an air of holiness, tied to the gifts of the Magi and the rituals of the Church. To burn frankincense was to drive away evil air as much as to perfume the chamber. To anoint with myrrh was to touch both medicine and miracle. Even more curious were the mineral cures. Ground gemstones were swallowed in powders, sapphire for fevers, emerald for poison, ruby for strengthening the heart. Coral was worn as an amulet against bleeding, amber against convulsions. Alchemists experimented with metals. Mercury, dangerous as it was, appeared in ointments, while gold leaf was stirred into tonics for kings who could afford such glittering indulgence. Each stone, each metal was thought to carry a hidden virtue, a strength lent by the earth itself. Trade also brought curiosities that bordered on the bizarre. Dried mummy flesh, stolen from Egyptian tombs and ground into powder, was sold as a cure for everything from bruises to epilepsy. Unicorn horn, or so it was claimed, appeared in the treasuries of princes, shaved into powder and swallowed to counteract poison. In truth, it was often narwhal tusk or horn of the rhinoceros, but the belief in its virtue mattered more than the truth of its origin. To drink unicorn horn was to drink safety itself, and in an age of frequent poisonings, no cost seemed too high. These exotic goods flowed into Europe through bustling ports like Venice and Genoa, their arrival stirring awe and suspicion alike. In markets, apothecaries displayed jars of powders and bundles of herbs, their labels exotic to local eyes: galangal, nutmeg, cassia, tamarind. Customers peered at them, sniffed them, and wondered at their power. Were they true medicines, or were they luxuries for the rich? Perhaps both. For the poor, such wonders were distant dreams. But even in humble villages, stories of faraway cures trickled down. A farmer might hear of a spice that cured fever. A pilgrim might bring home a scrap of resin from a shrine. And slowly the knowledge of the wide world seeped into daily life. Exotic medicine carried with it a sense of mystery. To drink a spice-laden tonic was to taste not only the remedy, but the distant lands from which it came. It was to imagine the deserts of Arabia, the markets of Alexandria, the caravans along the Silk Road. Medicine was not only healing, but a bridge to the wider world, each sip and swallow linking the sickbed to a globe alive with trade, faith, and discovery. And so, across Europe, in monasteries, palaces, and apothecaries' shops, the scent of foreign herbs mingled with the familiar smoke of wood fires. The remedies of faraway lands joined the charms of wise women and the tools of surgeons, all woven into the same great tapestry of healing. The medieval body, fragile and suffering, was treated not only with local herbs and prayers, but with powders that had traveled oceans, stones that had crossed mountains, and spices worth more than their weight in gold. Now thank you and good night, my listeners.